The MAGA world is kind of on fire right now. And they're on fire because they thought they were going to drain the deep state. And now it looks like the government is protecting the deep state. Pam Bondi said in February that she had the Epstein files on her desk. Now there are no Epstein files. Now Epstein ended his own life. And despite the claims of people like Patel and Bongino, while they were outside the offices of power, when they said they were going to release the files, when they said they were going to release everything from the JFK files to the Epstein files, and that it looks too suspicious, he probably offed himself. You know, I bet they're not releasing it to protect all sorts of elites and stuff, and, you know, the suppression and suppression this and suppression that. Then they get in there. Pam Bondi says that they have the files. Then, all of a sudden, Patel and Bongino start saying, actually, Epstein ended his own life, and we're going to prove it to you guys, but we're going to release it competently, the information, so you guys believe us, because we know how crazy that looks. And then they released these, they released this footage along with this memo has gotten out to the public stating that, you know, he didn't end his own life. There is no Epstein list. Don't worry about it. And there's a few problems with the footage. It wouldn't be the first time that there's been a problem with kind of like a smoke and mirrors to cover up the situation. Everybody remembers the notorious Epstein binders that were released earlier by Pam Bondi to a bunch of commentators that didn't have anything of note in those binders. But we have an update when it comes to the video feed, when it comes to the footage that was released by Patel, by the FBI, that they said, hey guys, this footage is like the unedited 12-hour raw footage of the camera for the outside of Epstein's cell. Now, there's a few problems with it. Number one, it's not the outside of Epstein's cell. It's the outside of a different cell. Epstein's cell is way across the other side, mostly obscured. And the stairway that leads to Epstein's cell is also obscured. You cannot really see Epstein's cell. You don't really know what's going on in there. There was also differences in the story between what was recently released. Before, they said that everybody was in their cell by 8 o'clock. Then, we saw on the new footage that was released that there was a man walking up towards Epstein's cell, which previously they said, oh, you know, now that was Epstein. That was Epstein walking into his cell after curfew. Okay, that's a change. That's a little weird. But the biggest thing, the most notorious thing, is that there was time missing from the footage. That there was whole chunks of time, like at least a minute in one area, where the footage was just gone. Now, the Trump administration explained this by saying, well, the reason why there's footage missing from the Epstein camera is because our security cameras are so old and so antiquated that every night at exactly midnight, a minute of footage is lost because it has to reset. Now, that's very convenient, but is it impossible? I mean, I don't know. I have no clue. I'm not an expert in prison security cam footage, but there are people who are experts in metadata. And the metadata in the footage shows that it is not the raw FBI footage. In fact, it was likely edited. In fact, it looks like it was likely edited in Adobe Premiere. The Department of Justice this week released nearly 11 hours of what it described as full raw surveillance footage from a camera position near Jeffrey Epstein's prison cell that night before he was found dead. The release was intended to address conspiracy theories about Epstein's apparent suicide in federal custody, but instead of putting those suspicions to rest, it may fuel them further. Metadata embedded in the video and analyzed by Wired and independent video forensics experts show that rather than being a direct export from the prison surveillance system, the footage was modified, likely using the professional editing tool Adobe Premiere Pro. The file appears to have been assembled from at least 2 source clips, saved multiple times, exported, and then uploaded to the DOJ's website, where it was presented as raw footage. Experts caution that it's unclear what exactly was changed, and that the metadata does not prove deception manipulation. The video may have simply been processed for public release using available software.
Shout out Orange Chicken. What a clucking good time.
You know, I gotta say, I am not bored. Thank you for the $5. With no modifications beyond stitching together 2 clips. But the absence of a clear explanation for the processing of the file using professional editing software complicates the Justice Department's narrative. In a case already clouded by suspicion, the ambiguity surrounding how the file was processed is likely to provide fresh fodder for conspiracy theorists. You know what else doesn't help? It also doesn't help that footage is missing and that the aspect ratio of the footage changes, indicating either editing or, I mean, at least like substantive changes. So the evidence just doesn't stack up right. This was something that they were going to be chewed up in if they were ever going to say Epstein ended his own life amongst the MAGA base, because of all of the theories, all of the speculation, and all of the things that have been published about Epstein and all of the powerful people he knows. But now that the administration is not being particularly transparent with the files and is butchering every single stage of the PR relations campaign of saying, oh, we had the files, or there aren't no files, we're gonna release everything, actually we're gonna release nothing, hey, why are you asking us about that? You can't ask us about that. That's offensive that the same day that we released an update about the files that you would ask us about the Epstein files. And now we're finding that the footage that they did release, when they try to clear it all up from the one camera in the prison that was working, even though, by the way, Patel said on Joe Rogan's program that the camera would be right over Jeffrey Epstein's cell. That wasn't the case. There's changes in the stories developing. They have rolled this out in such a terrible way. While I don't put it past these people to be so incompetent that they bungle it so bad that they make Jeffrey Epstein look like the least depressed man in the world, is how I'll put it, to get around YouTube censorship. But I mean, come on. It looks so bad. And the lack of transparency, knowing Donald Trump's historic relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, just adds so many layers of suspicion. Not to even talk about all the speculations about intelligence assets, of all the stuff that's not worth going into until it is confirmed. But this has led to legitimate backlash. Here is a very, very, let's just say, Trump curious podcast where the people on this podcast were saying that they voted for him based on how cool he was. They were so sick of the status quo. They don't like what they hit up with Biden, that he wasn't like super in the MAGA world, but drain the deep state and everything. Listen to how these guys had, MAGA friendly people on their program to talk policy. Listen to what these guys say about the lack of transparency and Trump being so scared to release this.
Are you still talking about Jeffrey Epstein? We have Texas, we have this, we have all of the things. And are people still talking about this guy, this creep?
So we're stupid. Yeah. we're the fucking idiots, guys. That is, I think, what is enraging people right now, is it's insulting our intelligence. Like, obviously the intelligence community is trying to cover it up. Obviously the Trump administration is trying to cover up. Something changed because they ran on this idea of exposing it all. All these guys had great ideas. Cockeyed Cash, Dan Bongino.
He had clips, dog. He had bars.
He was ready to tear it all down. He was ready to tear down the entire FBI office.
Shut down the Hoover building day one.
Day one.
That bitch still standing.
And then he goes on Joe Rogan and he's like, listen, do you think if I had it, I wouldn't share it with you?
I do.
Yeah.
I do.
I do believe that 100%, especially when you're staring at me like this, telling me that. Once you protect pedophiles, you are the most cockeyed person in the entire world.
So one of two things, in my mind, is it possible. One, you're covering it up. Or two, nothing really happened and you exploited the rape of thousands of children to get your man elected. So which one do you want here?
He's not wrong. He's not wrong. Would Trump really be so bad as to exploit? Yes. Anyway, by the way, this guy, Andrew Schultz, he wasn't on the Trump train, but he was in the caboose, I guess. He's now saying that the real America First people are other anti-establishment figures like Zoran Mondani, Bernie, AOC. You've seen this guy going from the right MAGA, like being able to vote for the same people they're voting for, over to saying, hey, maybe the socialist Democrats, the Democratic Socialists, maybe they're the ones that we're vibing with. I mean, what a transformation this guy's having. I mean, politics kind of wonky for it to change this much in a year who you're voting for or who you would cast your support behind. This thing has impact. It has impact. It hits hard. You know, you could point towards a million different scandals Trump has had once entering the office. I mean, the crypto scandal in and of itself should be making up an entire administration when you talk about the scale of likely corruption. But this is the one that's catching wind because Trump's always been a man for entertainment, and the Jeffrey Epstein story is something that has clutched the minds of much of the MAGA base and the theorizing and the thinking of who has what and who knows what for so long. They're not letting go. And it's getting to the point where the people who most talk about this, who most talked about Epstein, who most talked about, we need to release the files, we need to go out there and be aggressive on those, like protecting the deep state, XYZ. They are thinking about jumping ship. Dan Bongino, former law enforcement officer and Fox News host and podcaster, right-wing podcaster, really hardcore in MAGA world. Another one of those, Trump is going to bring the law and order and, trust in Trump, XYZ. And he has been very loyal to Trump since he's gotten into the White House. But now he's breaking rank. And apparently he didn't even come into work today. The deputy director of the FBI, the organization that's supposed to bust the terrorists in the United States, and the deputy director did not come into work today out of protest. Out of protest. And the reason why is he wanted to send the message that he's considering resigning between a major clash between the FBI, Trump's FBI, and Trump's Department of Justice, specifically Dan Bongino and Pam Bondi, over the rollout of this information around Jeffrey Epstein, what has been shown, what hasn't been shown, XYZ. And this fallout has been so substantive that he doesn't even want to be in Washington right now. He apparently has gone back down to Florida, and I assume is like, grilling or whatever, chilling and grilling. But I mean, they are clashing over this, and it has gotten ugly. Let's have Caitlin Collins, one of the people at CNN who are breaking this story, tell it directly from her own mouth before we give you the shocking update that just came out right as we were going live.
All right, this breaking news. Sources tell CNN that Deputy FBI Director Dan Bongino has told people that he's considering resigning amid a major clash between the FBI and DOJ over the continued fallout from the release, or lack thereof, of the Jeffrey Epstein memo. Joining us right now in files, joining us right now on the phone is CNN anchor and chief White House correspondent Caitlin Collins. Caitlin, what more are you learning?
Yeah, Fred, it remains to be seen if he actually follows through with what he has told colleagues. But what we do know is that Dan Bongino has told people he is considering resigning as the deputy director of the FBI over the fallout that has continued ever since this memo was released last Sunday. The anger inside the MAGA base has only continued to grow instead of going away, as some officials inside hoped it would. And now our colleagues, along with Christian Holmes, Tanner Rabinowitz, and Evan Perez, we're hearing that he's considering resigning after they had this heated confrontation with the Attorney General Pam Bondi over the handling of this earlier this week. And basically there was a meeting at the White House where the FBI Director, Patel, was there, the White House Chief of Staff, Susie Wiles. They were questioned about whether they were part of a story, that there was basically some infighting over how this came out, and this memo that said we're not going to be releasing any more information related to Jeffrey Epstein. And I should note that we are told Bongino denied leaking any story to this outlet that it was reported on. that there has been a lot of fighting between Attorney General Pam Bondi specifically and the leadership over at the FBI over who's to blame in this situation. I think the context here is obviously Dan Bongino, Kash Patel. They came from this MAGA world where they themselves had pushed a lot of questions about the so-called client list that Epstein had beforehand, and now the MAGA base is just not pleased or satisfied with what they've said in this memo that came out unsigned from the Justice Department and the FBI on Sunday night. So what we are told is Dan Bongino did not show up to work today, that he is essentially not there out of protest. But whether or not he actually follows through on this still remains to be seen. We're still reporting that out. But it just speaks to the backlash that the White House is very much feeling and understanding after this memo came out, despite President Trump the other day in the cabinet room asking, who still cares about this? One thing we know is the MAGA base certainly does.
All right, Kate.
So Dan Bongino is threatening resignation. Now, so far during the Trump administration, we haven't had many resignations outside of those at those lower than the cabinet when it comes to the government and actions that the Trump administration has taken. For example, the resignation of America's ambassador to Ukraine. That was something that was notable. Not willing to continue. They were not willing to continue to put on the song and dance, and being told to not directly call out the Russians after major air attacks, and told to do certain things that they just were not willing to do. But when we talk about Trump's cabinet, the only fly that's dropped so far was Mike Waltz. And of course, that was very embarrassing for Mike Johnson, who had to host another election in his district, and the RNC had to spend a lot of money to get that replacement vote and get a Republican elected there because, with such tight margins, they can't really afford to have any seats missing. And that was very expensive. And having that person that they fought, they pushed through the confirmation process and now was left on the tarmac, no longer national security advisor, just to give that position to Marco Rubio so he can dual serve. Very messy, very silly, and I think probably in large part due to the consequences of the Signal scandal. Now, Dan Bongino dropping would be another example of a TV defender of Trump, because Mike Waltz used to go on TV and fight for Trump as a congressman, even when Trump was in some of his worst scandals and he dropped. But this would be not Mike Waltz falling out of favor and dropping. This would be Dan Bongino jumping ship over the issue of Jeffrey Epstein and Pam Bondi, in his mind, mishandling how this is going. Now, this in and of itself would already be the second cabinet drop. I mean, if you want to include deputy director in the cabinet in the same way as national security advisor. But this is not where it ends, because shortly before we started streaming,
Dense Pixel got a tier 3 subscription.
Hey, thank you for the tier 3 sub, Dense Pixel. I really appreciate that. I will use every dime of that on gas costs to go to the front. Thank you. The subs on the website really do help. All the donations on the website really do help. They really do pull their weight, and I mean it. They really do. Thank you so much for the tier 3 sub. Not tier 2, not tier 1, but tier 3. So as we were going live, we had this bombshell drop. It's not just Dan Bongino that's thinking of jumping ship. It's also Kash Patel. According to a Friday report from Axios, Bongino and Bondi clash over President Donald Trump's administration handling of the Jeffrey Epstein case. As a result, Bongino and Bondi reportedly got into it. That led to Bongino taking off from work on Friday in protest. Not long after that reporting, Olana added that Patel has joined Bongino in his stand against Bondi. Sources close to the Department of Justice says Kash Patel also wants Pam Bondi gone. Gone. Now it's not they're just fighting over Jeffrey Epstein and how this has been handled. It's you're the problem. You're the reason this has gone wrong. You have to go. Mind you, Donald Trump's already had enough problems with the attorney general races. I mean, he tried to put through Matt Gaetz. That was a disaster. Matt Gaetz was a little too diddly for Congress, okay? Little too diddly. And then They put up Pam Bondi, pushed her through. Hardcore Trump loyalist will say anything for the man, will twist the law for the man, will do anything he wants, unlike previous first-term appointments. So she gets through after the Matt Gaetz failure, and if she had to jump ship again and he had to go to a third DOJ head within the first year of his administration, hell, we're just over the halfway mark for the year. We're just over the halfway mark. It's half of a year's down, and we could be down 2 DOJs or a DOJ pick, a DOJ head versus an FBI head and an FBI deputy head. Now, to be completely honest, right? Is there somebody else better for the FBI head position than Kash Patel? Absolutely. If Kash Patel and Dan Bongino both resigned and they were replaced by anyone with a modicum of deep management, law enforcement experience, they would be better. So, in a roundabout way, whether it's if Pam Bondi survives, I do think that our country gets safer by having more competent people in the position when reports indicate that Kash Patel is bored in his briefing meetings and he's trying to lessen the amount of briefings that the FBI head gets every day. In fact, he wants it to be, actually, I don't get a briefing every day. Can we do every other day? Which is not how the previous FBI heads did it. So if Kash Patel was replaced and Dan Bongino was replaced, if they jump ship, I think that would be probably pretty good for the country. But that would also probably be pretty bad for MAGA. It's not like Kash Patel and Dan Bongino are really known for keeping their mouths shut. While it would be pretty embarrassing if they jumped ship and said, I was told to lie. I went on Joe Rogan's and said Jeffrey ended his own life for the administration, for the regime. That would be pretty humiliating. If he went out there and just said, look, it has to do with transparency, and we weren't transparent about it. It was rolled out poorly. And so it's not a question of whether or not Jeffrey ended his own life. It's a question of transparency. Maybe it'll come off a little bit better. But they're going to be loud. They're going to have to talk about it. They're going to have to explain where they went. And they're probably going to continue to pick fights with Pam Bondi. And when you go on MAGA social media right now, if you go on X and their circles, whether you're going from knuckle draggers like Cat Turd to window lickers in other venues, they seem to be generally united around Dan Bongino and Kash Patel. To them, this is an example of the fight against the deep state, the fight to figure out what truly happened with Jeffrey. And Dan Bongino and Kash Patel, I remember them from the podcasts. I remember them from the Monday shows. The morning shows or whatever, and all the different podcasts they went on. And they said they were going to go after the deep state. They said they were going to release the Epstein files. They said they were going to get to the bottom of who exactly was on Epstein's client list. They said they were going to get all of this. And now we're finding out that there's a feud between them and Pam Bondi. Pam Bondi must be the problem. Pam Bondi did say in February she had a list on her desk. Now there's no list. Now Epstein ended his own life. Now nothing else has to be released. It's a lot easier if you are within the MAGA movement to point the finger at Pam Bondi than it is ultimately to point the person who could at any point overrule all of them and just put it out there tomorrow, and that is Donald J. Trump. And so whether or not Pam Bondi becomes a fall gal for this scandal, whether or not Dan Bongino and Kash Patel both resign out of anger of this, or if Trump comes in and just tells them all to quiet down and shut up and stop talking about Epstein, we're going to move on to other things. We're going to move on to other political topics. All of these are possibilities, and all of them have their own benefits and negatives. If Dan Bongino and Kash Patel jump, good for the country. Going to anger the MAGA movement when there's already some anxieties in the MAGA movement around this specifically. And the issue isn't going away. That'll just make it worse. If Pam Bondi drops, well, that means they have to go through with another DOJ nomination after Matt Gaetz failed. Then they got Pam Bondi through. Then she gets ejected. She gets yeeted. It's not a good look. Having to replace your FBI head is a problem. But, I mean, again, Kash Patel isn't exactly the most competent FBI head. He could be replaced, and it wouldn't really do too much damage to the actual administering of the state, but it probably would hurt the image of the base for a bit. But I mean, like the best option for Trump, honestly, is if he can quiet out all down. If he can quiet for him personally, politically, assuming no Kash Patel or Dan Bongino based scandals that could come in the future, or Pam Bondi based scandals. And of course, that's a big if, and that is not an if I am necessarily giving them. If he can get them all to shut up and just stop talking about it and hope it goes away, and it does go away, that's the best case scenario. But there's always the risk of it not going away, dragging it out, and then you have to make another call a month from now. Whether that means releasing another tranche of files and actually releasing something just to clear the air, whether it means continuing to ignore it until eventually the news gets swept up with other stories, dragging this out, only for it to be brought out again against you in the midterms, whatever it could be. That does mean another fly doesn't have to drop. So there's going to be a question. Is it better to just rip the Band-Aid off now or later? And even if you do rip it off, what follows? Okay, Pam Bondi's gone. Now do you release the Epstein files? I mean, when analyzing this, it's kind of difficult because we don't know what the stakes are. What's in the files? Is there not a client list? Is Donald Trump not indicted or included in that evidence? Is other high-ranking Republicans indicted or included? Or other high-ranking Democrats included, even though I doubt that would be the main thing holding it back from Trump. You never, it could be both. Are high-ranking intelligence officials included? Was he an intelligence asset? What? Of course, there's all that speculation about all different intelligence connections, both domestic and international. So until, since we don't know the stakes, it's hard to measure it. But if Pam Bondi jumps ship, the next step is you have to be more transparent about the Epstein files. No? You can't just say, hey, I'll reward you guys. Pam Bondi, go. And then say, okay, problem solved. Well, no, now release the Epstein files. Now that Pam Bondi, the deep state protector, is gone, release the Epstein files. And that is the dilemma Trump's in. Does the DOJ and does the DOJ head get chopped and then you have to replace her with something else, go through that process while advancing on the Epstein files in some way, whether you can wiggle way out of it or not? Do you just bite the bullet and have Dan Bongino and Kash Patel possibly jump ship, which is going to play bad with the base? Or do you get them all to just quiet down and hope the problem goes away? Not really any good options for Trump right now. All bad choices. Maybe you shouldn't have promised to release those files if you weren't going to do it. But, of course, that was promised when he had the immediate problem of getting elected. Now that he's elected, well, mission accomplished.